talk. So what is this about? It's about how to talk or how not to talk about the elephant in the freezer. I want to explain more about that in a minute. So who am I? I'm a postdoc sociologist who, for some weird reason, sits in a molecular ecology lab here at Cardiff Uni. And as you can see there in the top left corner, that's my project, or that's our project. I'm actually from Frankfurt, came here in November to stay half a year with those people there on that table to find out what they're doing, and especially... No? Yeah. Oh, there we go. These two projects on the left, so CryoArks and the Frozen Ark, and there's all sorts, like a ton of institutions involved in that, which you can see on the right. I hope I did not forget any of them. Some are very central, I think, to one of both actually of the projects, especially Cardiff Uni. Some are more peripherally, say, involved. But yeah, I think that shows you some of the complexity of these two things that I'm supposed to research as. So how does that work? Why send a sociologist to Cardiff to work on molecular ecology? You might be expecting sociologists to work on different topics. So my toolkit sort of looks like, no, wrong one. Yeah, like this. So I've got a camera, I've got a recorder, a notebook where I write down observations and all sorts of stuff. You might argue that the recorder and the camera is already a bit of overkill because you could just do that with a smartphone. So really it's not rocket science. I guess most of you could do that. Mia once described me as a highly trained sociologist. I think that's a big exaggeration. I'm not highly trained to do this, actually. I just ended up doing it. So how does that work? So the idea behind this whole thing is to do ethnography. The person who came up with that concept in the current or the modern sense of that term is Bronislaw Malinowski, a Polish / Austro-Hungarian / British / American anthropologist who found himself in Australia during the First World War and realized he could not go back to Europe anymore. But the Australian government kindly allowed him to go to the Trobriand Islands to conduct ethnographic or anthropological studies. He also tried to impress an Australian lady who was an amateur photographer, so he bought himself a camera to prove to her that he was a worthy love interest. And then he was basically stuck for 4 years during the First World War on the Trobriand Islands, and took some interesting photographs, but tried to document the everyday life of people there. And that is sort of the concept that I'm trying to apply to the molecular ecology lab here at Cardiff Uni. But more specifically, these two projects on the left, to find out what is actually the work that they're doing all about, what does that entail. So what it looks like is, those are some vignettes. Those two are animal cryobanking or biobanking projects, so they're about biobanking all sorts of animal material, from DNA to cells to blood to whatnot. So whatever might end up in a molecular ecology lab might actually then go there, but not just molecular ecology labs, also zoos or museums. And the idea is that is to collect that sort of material and make it available to science. Now, when I usually tell people what I'm doing, say at a party, the first reaction is usually, oh, so you're working on this. Actually, we spent, so you can see how serious sociology or science is. I spent 90% of the work on this talk on designing that slide. And I said Mike's going to hate it. Because, yeah, this is the first, so it's like Jurassic Park, isn't it? And yeah, kinda, it might be. But actually, and this is the elephant in the freezer or the elephant in the room, it's not actually what I guess people in Frozen Ark or CryoArks want people to talk about or want to be perceived. But it's usually the first thing that comes up, and I think you may have had a similar association with that topic when I just described it, which means you're actually very, very smart and bright, because without knowing a lot of it, this was your first association, if that's actually what came up in your head. The reason I'm saying that you're bright is that there's also sociologists, my colleagues, who spend a lot of time and work on talking exactly about this, and takes them 2 years to publish a journal article on this, whereas my friends, and maybe you too, at a party can come up with this in 5 seconds. So it is an intriguing question. Is this really about, the cells that these people got from the freezer? Can we resurrect, for example, mammoths? This is a mastodon, I probably have to say. So extinct animals, can we bring them back not just from the brink, but from the grave? Can we actually not just stop extinction, but turn the clock back? And will we see mammoths roam across the Eurasian continent in the future? Yeah, well, maybe. But that's probably not the point. I'm not going to debunk or support this. The question for me is rather, why does all discussion about this always gravitate to that point? And why do the people who I am supposed to observe or work with always have to deal with that question? Are you going to bring back the mammoth? What's it about with or the elephants in your freezers? Are you going to bring them back to life? And it's an interesting question. It's a question that not just you or people at a party want to talk about, or if you go to a public outreach event, is also people like me, sociologists, who are supposed to contribute some sort of critical or second level observation to this, find themselves wanting to talk about it. And it's not that far off. You may have heard about the northern white rhino, functionally extinct in the wild. There's now a couple of attempts to bring it back from frozen material, actually. So, yeah, this is obviously something that draws a lot of attention. There's lots of media reports about this. So why don't people in the Frozen Ark or CryoArks, why do they not want to talk about this? The problem is probably that's maybe only the tip of the iceberg. It's one answer. The other thing is that it's not just about bringing back animals from the brink or resurrecting them in the lab. There's many other uses, from surveying populations, historic populations. It's become much harder to get animal material samples to do research on from the wild. It's not as easy as, say, 50 years ago to just collect them in the wild, bring them to the lab. So one idea behind it is really to be a bit more sustainable and also future-oriented when we use samples, animal samples. We're not sampling the same things 50 times over when we actually got this material in some freezer in a university building or in a zoo. So that is, I think, one big contribution that CryoArks and Frozen Ark are trying to make. However, whenever we bring up this topic, it always ends up, sooner or later, some Jurassic Park scenario. And it's very difficult to get away from this, and you spend a lot of time, or I spend a lot of time, I found myself spending a lot of time trying not to debunk, but also point to, the other uses that we might have for this animal material. And I guess the reason for that is that there's things we like to talk about, especially when, in the Science Café, we like to talk about the cool output, cool findings, our projects, our results. We like to turn it into a nice little narrative. We want to show, okay, this is the bottom line of the story. But before we get there, there's really all the boring stuff. And I'm sorry, I have to say, you're not boring people, but your work is super boring, because 90% of your time you spend looking at Excel tables, and I can't figure this out in R, and can you help me? And my data's all off, and I have to change my question because, so I'm not going to write a book about this, I'm sorry. Like, no one's going to, but your work is important, and for this, figuring stuff out, looking at the computer screen, is becoming more and more important, I think. So it used to be a lot of lab work, a lot of field work, but increasingly biologists are working on the screen, staring at the screen, yelling at the screen probably. And that's a difficult thing to sell to an audience. So if you say, we need this animal trial bank because it will help me do my work on my laptop and get my data a bit quicker, that's not a very sexy thing compared to resurrecting a rhino or doing the next Jurassic Park, but it's just as important. And I think even if you're not all that interested in animal trial banks, that is a general problem in the sciences. So there's things like infrastructure, frustrating that work, bureaucracy, Excel tables, that you find very hard to explain to your mum or your dad or your friends, but they take up a lot of time, and they are important. They're just often not that well funded, because that's not, just a thing with the public. It's also about, if you want to fund long-term projects or programs or infrastructure, it's much harder to get money for that compared to, I've got a nice little sexy project that will be wrapped up within 3 years, and I need this and that money for it. People are much more willing to fund that kind of project because they say, okay, in 3 years I will see results, I get some return on my investment maybe, whereas here, for a biobank that will run for 50 years, what's the use if you're not going to resurrect mammoths, really? So, why not use, the sexy part of it, the resurrection science, to fund this, the boring part. So you don't have to talk to the public about this, Excel tables, who cares? Just tell them, I'm going to resurrect the mammoth to get money for Excel tables. The problem is that at some point, sooner or later, and I think that was one point why you were so reluctant to engage in that narrative, they want to see their elephant, which you promised them. And it is a really tricky situation, because people are not likely to give you money for this. You don't want to just engage in that. So what could you do in order not to make any false promises? And it's not just a problem for molecular ecologists or biologists, it's also a problem for me. Because I think one contribution I could make, or sociology of science could make, is to point out ways in which this is important and find out nice little interesting stories that are not as boring as an Excel table. But as you can see, I don't have any pictures of an Excel table or what you actually do in the lab, because it's not just, it's very difficult to find an image for it, to find a narrative for it, to wrap it in a story. And I think it's a big challenge, not just for sociology, but also for science in general. This is an important part of science. It does not maybe make for a great Science Café talk, I agree. But I think we need ways, and we need to come up with ways of highlighting how that is important, how that is central to science, and how that is also a worthy investment of time and money, and that also people outside of science will say, yeah, this is something that I would like to support with my taxpayer money. Okay. So much from me. Thank you very much. If you want to read more on CryoSocieties, we've also got 2 sub-projects on Excel banking, human Excel banking in Spain, and human cord banking in Germany. You can follow us on Twitter at CryoSocieties, or look at our website on cryosocieties.eu. Thank you very much.